Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating with Imperium. I'd like to welcome you to another webinar. We are very excited about this one. As you all know, this has been a crazy 2020, and so we decided that now is the right time for us to do our top 5 mobile security stories of a crazy 2020. And we decided that we should have a little bit of fun and be a little bit crazy in terms of how we go about doing it. So before we dive in and before I introduce my partner in crime here today, usual perfunctory conversation, please use the Q&A capability that's there to send any questions you want. We're going to try and keep this to around 35 minutes worth of content. And then at the tail end, if there's questions, we will field those. If there's not, then we will give you back and send you on your way for the rest of the day. There will be an archived version of this up. And we'll also do a blog covering it to hit some of the key points. So if there's anything in particular that you find interesting or want to share with folks, feel free to do so. That'll be up within a day or so. So with that, let me introduce my partner in crime, Scott King, who is another member here at Imperium. And most notably, Scott is the author of pretty much every mobile app threat report we've been doing, including all the ones we did around financial services apps around the world. So Scott, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure, JT, and yeah, I'm excited about crazy mobile security stories. It says top 5. I probably could have listed about 50, but so picking top 5 was pretty tough.
Absolutely, I completely agree. And along the lines of what Scott's talking about, and we mentioned, that this is going to be kind of fun, and we're going to be a little bit crazy about it. A lot of you folks have probably seen, different sports shows, or it could be pretty much about anything. We decided to have a little bit of fun, and rather than just list 5 that Scott and I agreed on together, we decided to be a little bit more fun, to follow the technique where we will unveil each of our top 5, starting with number 5, going to number 1 independently. So when a moment, I'm going to pass it over, and Scott's going to give his number 5. I'll give my number 5, and they were not done together. Because we thought it would actually be kind of fun to see what sort of things caught his attention and what sort of things caught my attention. Some people would say that's not a real smart thing to do for a webinar, but we thought, hey, it's 2020, so we're on the dorsal end, we're on the back end of 2020, and it's been crazy. Why not have this be a little bit crazy? So with that, let me start with one of the first things we're going to do, because we thought, okay, if we don't take this one out, then it's not going to be all that exciting. And that is this. Shockingly, if you guys haven't heard, there's the coronavirus. There's a pandemic going around the world. And we thought, you know what? That is a macro trend. That is, clearly that has changed pretty much everything. So it's not really mobile security specific. So we said, let's take that one out. And that was one of the agreements that we had, a gentleman's agreement on our top 5. Let's take the virus part itself out. There can be ramifications, was part of the rules and guidelines we gave each other. But let's just say that is so big and so over the top that we're not going to actually allow it. Otherwise, it would have to be number 1 on both lists. It would have to, because it's fundamentally changed everything. So first part of our crazy list, coronavirus off the table. So that's that. So now with that, like I said, we're going to dive in to each one of our top 5s, and we're going to do it in the snake draft format to kind of keep you guys going. So with that, Scott, why don't you tell us what your number 5 is?
Well, my top 5 did change since you didn't let me pick coronavirus, because obviously, I mean, that just kicked off a lot of different events, right? If you look at global trends, that's what criminals follow. That's basically how spear phishing and malware work, right? They kind of jump onto a trend. But my number 5 was is when a kid was on TikTok and all these apps were being promoted and they had totally excessive permissions, turns in a tip to basically, cybercrime watchers, right? Crime Stoppers type of deal. and says, "Hey, I think these apps are really bad." So this was my top five is, security researchers are tipped off from some kid on TikTok.
Yeah, no, that's a that was a great one, and that one was in fact on my list, but it wasn't quite as high as where you put it. So my number five, Scott. Actually, it's funny. I'm going to give credit to a colleague of ours, Allison, because she was the one who actually came up with the perfect quote for this, and her quote was, to show you how long 2020 has been, the Jeff Bezos hack actually occurred this year. And so my number five is not just the fact that obviously a very well known, potentially high value in quote target actually had his phone hacked, because this happened right before the pandemic and it was all across the news and had geopolitical issues and everything on those lines. In this particular case, it just happened to be that it used WhatsApp as a delivery mechanism. But this was huge news. This was huge news. You could also kind of argue that if somebody that is in Mr. Bezos's position, yes, you could say that, well, likely he could be a target, but then the other part is, where was the security? Where was the protection for the device itself? And as we kind of rolled through the year, that has become a major topic of discussion and has become a major focal point. The simple fact is the fact that over 60% of endpoints accessing the enterprise, for instance, are mobile, and since they are in fact endpoints and they're accessing a lot of the same data, we need to protect them. One of the things I still think is pretty interesting is, and potentially because of the pandemic and all the attention going elsewhere, most of the attention on the hack of Mr. Bezos was on the personal side of things, just because of the attempt to blackmail and things on those lines. But simple fact is, he probably had a lot of corporate information on that device as well. That never bubbled up as a story, but to me was a very important point. So with that, any comments on that one, Scott? Any additional thoughts on this? Are you surprised that this is on the list, or are you surprised that that occurred in 2020?
Well, so yeah, the UN came out with a report on that hack, and what I am surprised, because I think it's on my next slide. I think I picked this as number 4. If you could go and change the slide.
Yeah, actually, we're going to go to my number 4 next.
Oh, okay. So I think it is. So, so I messed up the order there. So that's how crazy 2020 is. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, especially somebody so busy, everything like basically, if you think of all your connection points and all your communication, it collides on a single device, right? It collides on your mobile device because it fits in your pocket,
Right.
and there is personal and corporate information on it. So,
Yeah, so
yeah, I mean,
actually,
it's your most vulnerable point.
yeah, to your point, Scott, since this is a crazy 2020, why don't you hit your number 4? And
Yeah, there you
then
go.
I'll go back
So,
to mine. You know,
yeah, so I picked but WhatsApp, right? So Jeff Bezos and a couple of Spanish politicians were all hacked in the same way, right? So they got these texts, these spear phishing texts sent to their WhatsApp, and the malware escaped the WhatsApp vulnerability and infected their device. So you know you try to use a messaging platform or an app that is encrypted, but if you don't understand the vulnerabilities of the app in combination with the vulnerabilities of the operating system that it runs on, then you're really ignoring the fact that you are vulnerable. So just because someone tells you it's secure doesn't really mean it's secure. So I picked. I knew Jeff was in there somewhere, but it's the WhatsApp vulnerabilities. I kind of lumped it in with them because there were other stories that were very similar to Jeff Bezos.
yeah, no, that's great, and I think an ongoing theme, and I know for a fact I'm going to hit it one more time. I don't know about you. Is the whole concept of vulnerabilities. Simple fact is, no platform is 100% bulletproof. No app is 100% bulletproof. And that's why just in the mobile world, just like in the traditional endpoint world, that we constantly have to be looking, finding, patching vulnerabilities, as well as providing protection behind vulnerabilities when something goes and exploits it, like in the case that we were just discussing here with the WhatsApp. So so our number fives, we just went through the kid finding the issue, and then Mr. Bezos's hack. Scott went with his number four in terms of the WhatsApp vulnerabilities directly correlated with it. My number four was another one that kind of changed, like in this case, changed an entire company, and that is TikTok, right? Um, TikTok was across the news in terms of some of the issues that people were having, some of the concerns they were having with it from a geopolitical standpoint. And again, in my mind, it's less about TikTok specifically as the macro issue that TikTok just happened to become a poster child for. And part of what that is we've been talking, but we just discussed vulnerabilities, actual holes in apps that can be exploited or platforms that can be exploited. But there's also app security risks, right? There's many things in terms of like where is, from a privacy or security standpoint, where is my data going, and how much control do I have over that, which is usually very little. How much visibility do I have on it, from a consumer standpoint, is usually very little. If you're an enterprise and you have apps on your employees' devices, do I know where that data is going? Do I know if it's encrypted? The app risk side of things, in addition to a device risk side of things, really reared its head in 2020. What do you think, Scott? Any comments on that?
Yeah, I like this one. TikTok really, like you said, people just woke up on where their data is really going, and you know, they they figured out personally, like, okay, maybe I really don't understand how all of this works. And when you get to the geopolitical landscape, when you talk about banning some type of app because it's siphoning data to somewhere that you don't want it, like that is a big deal. So I think TikTok, the influence of TikTok, like the ripple effect, um, it should have been pretty high on my list. It wasn't, but very similar to the coronavirus, how it kicked off a chain of events. I think TikTok is going to do the same thing from a privacy perspective in how we consume, and produce data on our phones. So,
Yeah, no,
hope.
I think you're right, Scott. And another one that didn't make my list, but it might have made yours. But I'm just going directly off what you're talking about, was the Zoom bombing concept. When everybody started working remotely and everything, and people started using, there were issues that became very obvious with Zoom, large portion of which was configuration. Simple things like people setting passwords for meetings and things like that. That wasn't really a Zoom thing. It was, this is something any conferencing software is going to have to deal with, which I think is very similar to what you were talking about on the TikTok side, right? Because I mean, you've been doing these reports for financial services. We've done reports on dating apps. We've done reports on shopping apps, and a lot of the same issues are there. And I think a decent part of it is because mobile apps are basically kind of Legos. The developers are going to put them together and they'll say, hey, I need access to a camera. They'll run out and they'll grab the Lego that can actually click in to give them access to a camera, but they might not really know where that information is going or any of the rest of things. So I think it's very similar. So let's now go to number three, Scott. What is your number three?
Is my number three, or oh yeah. So apps know what you type and copy and paste. So again, kind of with TikTok, right? So what kind of data that I put in there and who has access to that data. So this is related to the iOS 14 beta when it first came out and people installed it, and then they noticed that some apps had access to your pasteboard or your keyboard, and the operating system would warn you like, hey, Reddit is monitoring what you're typing right now in LinkedIn or Twitter or some other app. And it flipped people out. And there was a lot of videos on Twitter that day on how this worked. So you got this little pop-up warning says, hey, this app is actually reading, what you're typing in another app. So I think the privacy aspect of that is again going to change the way we really think about our private information.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I completely agree. So my number three, again, similar to in some ways the TikTok example, where when TikTok happened, all of a sudden, to Scott's point about visibility, all of a sudden, all the enterprises that are using our software, they were like, okay, we know that you have app risk analysis, which is part of our solution, Z3A, for advanced app analysis, is that we know that you've got that capability. What's happening with all these apps that are in our environment? So it raised this consciousness of what was happening. The other one that raised a lot of attention and had a lot of folks coming in was the iOS mail app vulnerability. And again, it feels like this was a 2019 thing, but it wasn't. It was in fact earlier this year. And this was, again, back to our point of there is no perfectly bulletproof platform or app, et cetera. This is when there was a mail app vulnerability that was disclosed that had been present in the mail app for years, that depending on what version, for instance, iOS 13 could be zero touch in terms of the ability for an attacker. If the iOS mail app, this is the mail app that actually comes on every single iPhone, as it was sitting on it was in the background, the attacker using a certain crafted email could create a buffer overflow and actually be able to start reading all emails, et cetera, and potentially even deliver an exploit to compromise the device completely. And I think a huge part of why it was so newsworthy was because almost everybody, even for their corporate email, if you were on an iPhone, you were actually using the embedded provided iOS mail app as the access method to all of your corporate email. And when the recommendation from a lot of the security experts was use an alternative email platform or program until it gets patched, which it took about a month for it to get patched, it raised a lot of interest and a lot of concerns and a lot of what ifs, and got a lot of attention. Got a lot of attention. But like I said, it's not anything inherently in iOS. It just happened to be that it was the iOS mail app, similar to some of the other vulnerabilities we've been discussing, for instance, in the WhatsApp side of things. So we're down to our top two, and this ought to be pretty interesting to see kind of how we go. And I'm going to go first. And my number two might seem a little bit self-serving, and I almost made it number one. But my number two was an announcement we made last week, which is the United States Department of Defense through DISA and DIU, agencies of the Department of Defense, selected Zimperium to protect mobile devices of their service men and women around the world. Now, like I said, that might seem a little bit self-serving, but let me tell you why I made it my number two. It is two simple facts. First thing is, they would not have gone through the entire process and gone through this effort and everything if the threat wasn't in fact real. Going all the way back to my number one with Jeff Bezos, right? If there's nothing to protect, you don't need to protect it, right? So clearly, it's a reinforcement of what we have known and the industry has known for quite some time, which is these threats are real. The second part is that it completely, utterly, without question, reinforces the fact that mobile devices are endpoints. And for many, many, many people, and especially in this kind of world we're in now, but particularly for the servicemen and women in this particular case, mobile devices might be their only platform, if not their primary platform going forward. So the fundamental concept of, the bad guys are always going to be looking for the weakest link. They're always going to be going where the value is. The fact that the DoD made this announcement, yes, they picked us. So that part is awesome. Got a whole, you can read our blog about why they picked us. This session today is not a product session. It's a top security story session. But those two key messages of the threat is real and mobile is a primary endpoint, if not the primary endpoint going forward, was the reason I picked it as number 2. So Scott, how about your number 2?
My number 2 is the fact that people are always chasing their tail. So all of these remote access banking Trojans, like when one comes out, they're like, okay, do you have a signature for that? And I'll just monitor for the hash and the signature, and then I'm done. But what happens is, this year, when you have Anubis, BlackRock, Cerberus, and then the Alien, which was a couple of months ago, these things evolve so fast. They just change them just a little bit. They still work. They're grabbing our banking credentials. We don't go to bank branches anymore because we're all at home, right? Coronavirus not being number one, but I mean, the fact that these things continuously evolve, they evade detection because the people creating these malwares are, they're trained professionals. They're probably just as good or better than the developers that you have working in your shops, and they're looking for the easy money. And just like you said with your number 2, it's a primary endpoint. you know banking, for banking, for me, my primary endpoint is mobile, down to the fact that someone reimbursed me with a check, which they didn't actually write the check. They did like a check by email or electronic check or whatever, but it gets automatically emailed to me. So I'm stuck with this piece of paper, and just take a picture of it and deposit it, right? So
Mhm.
the fact that you have to monitor whether or not these things are present on your user's device, a device that you don't control, right? So you need to understand the health of that device, because the next iteration is already being worked on, right? And probably the second iteration is already being worked on to evade detection. So so watch out, because these things are, they're like a virus.
Yeah, well, and I think for most people knows Imperium as the leader in enterprise mobile threat defense, which is predominantly basically endpoint security, mobile EDR, if you will, if you're coming from the endpoint side of the world. But we also have a set of solutions called MAPS for Mobile App Protection Suite that actually includes being able to put our machine learning based detection directly inside of mobile apps, including we have financial services customers that have actually embedded that engine inside their apps to be able to detect things like this. And Scott, coming from the endpoint security side of the world, the concept of threats that are morphing and evolving and everything is the whole reason why next generation EPP or EDR, actually was created. And so it's not really baffling, but yet still seems to be surprising people that that's exactly what's happening in the mobile world. Why would the bad guys go back to making it easy to find them? So the fact that it's morphing and stuff doesn't totally surprise me, but the pace, I think, surprises me. And I know when you were doing those the webinars on the financial apps around the world, what was the stat for the RSA fraud on mobile? And wasn't it higher than other channels? Do you remember the stat
Well,
by chance?
there's, I don't know exactly which one you're referring to,
The
but
dollar figure of fraud.
yeah, so the RSA report, so the Q1 of 2020, it came out and it said for every, 1 out of every 4 fraudulent transactions actually occurred via a mobile device, and that could be app or browser, right? So they just said mobile. But if a fraudulent transaction occurred or was initiated on a mobile device, it was over 2 times as valuable. It was $764, I believe, was the average. So if you don't catch a mobile fraudulent mobile transaction, it hurts really bad. And yet all these banks, they have, they'll tell you, oh, we monitor all this IP geolocation, yada yada. But with these banking trojans, they know you're using that, so they know how to get around it.
Right. Right.
It was really interesting that most of the fraud occurred on a mature account, which was greater than 90 days old, but a brand new device. So that would be very indicative of you surrendered your credentials somewhere, and somebody else somewhere logged in as you on a new device. So that was it, the pattern is there.
It fits in perfectly with concept, for instance, of the BlackRock malware of stealing your credential directly off it via a template overlay and then potentially using it off a regular computer online, right? So we're down to our number ones. And I'm going to have you go, Scott, because I think this one will be familiar. Your number one crazy or story of a crazy 2020.
So my number one, yeah, you stole my thunder. I put this as number one because I thought you were going to put this as number one, because it would have been further down on my list, but I was trying to game the system. But if you think about what the Department of Defense did, right, and you said the threat is real. I mean, you don't have to convince me, right? Like I have had hacking attempts on my mobile device, so I know, and I detected it, right? Um, but if you think about what the military does, right? So they secure the rest of us, and then they go out into the field, and basically try to secure other areas of the world so they don't they don't come into our country or whatever. But these guys wear helmets because they bang their head. They wear bulletproof vests because bullets fly at them. They wear knee pads and glasses. They have all types of protections, right? And it's all about logistics. So the military, they are logistical experts. If you look at how they move people and equipment, and do war fighting, they're logistical experts. And to be a logistical expert, you have to have very effective communication. And so effective communication is happening on their mobile devices. So, they realize that, okay, if we're going to use these things, we don't control, the entire ecosystem in our logistical efforts. So we really need to make sure that our information is kept safe, just like our warfighters are kept safe. So I put that as a number one because clearly they need to maintain privacy.
No, that's perfect, and I agree with you 100%. And my number one, you might argue maybe I was cheating a little bit, kind of like Scott talking about gaming the system. And we said that coronavirus was not on the table, but the ramifications of coronavirus were. And the simple fact is, our world has changed from a computing standpoint, and it's forever changed, basically. And I'll tell you kind of why I'm saying that. But my number one is, I guarantee almost everybody watching this webinar right now, at least 90% of the people watching this webinar right now are working from home. And what we saw was a huge spike. And then there's also the remote learning side of things. So all of a sudden, overnight, people had to start being able to work from anywhere, even though mostly it was homes, from any device. And what do I mean by any device? Because it was a scramble, right? Still is a scramble. BYOD became huge because corporations couldn't get new stuff out as quickly as possible. Organizations, agencies couldn't get stuff out as quickly as possible. Remote learning, Chromebooks became huge. Right now, Chromebooks, the backlog on getting Chromebooks is 6 months. So for a lot of schools, they're still playing catch up. And so for me, and we have a very active customer advisory board of some of the largest, most sophisticated organizations around the world across every vertical, financial, federal government, state and local, education, goes through the entire thing. and in our most recent cab, we had an entire interactive session on remote working, the impacts of the pandemic, and to a person, they said, yeah, well, before this, maybe 20% of our people were working remotely. At the time we had this cab, which was in May, there were like 90% of our people are working remotely. But almost to a person, they said the majority of our skilled workers, the office workers, knowledge workers, the majority will still be working remotely after this. Part of the reason they're saying that is they've looked at their numbers and they've realized productivity is up. We don't have to have as much commercial real estate. It's safer. People are actually spending more time with their families. So the whole overall concept of the fundamental shift to anywhere from any device, anytime, remote working, remote learning, to me was by far the number one story overall. And it's been fascinating for us. So with that, we would like to stop for a second, see if we have any questions. And also in the meantime, if anybody is interested in having any conversations, would like to find out more about any of these threats, or specifically Zimperium and our solutions, for instance, why Department of Defense selected us, or why banks are selecting us to prevent some of the threats like the morphing trojans that Scott was talking about, feel free to shoot me an email. It's jt.keating@zimperium.com. And so I'm looking and I'm not seeing any questions. And so with that, I would just like to say thank you, Scott. That was a lot of fun. So thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.
And thank you everybody else for giving us some of your time. And we hope you have yourself a great day, and that the rest of 2020 won't be as crazy as the front half. Thanks, y'all.